So CZ, yeah, quite interesting. People don't realize this, but we actually have two variations of rugby. So one is known as rugby union, and this is more commonly, and this is what we've been talking about in this episode. But you also have a variation called rugby league. So we need to go back in history a little bit to find the origin of this. So back in the 1800s, we had rugby union being played all over, to a point where it became quite a spectacle to watch. So what happened was after a while is that back in 1895, we had 22 clubs from England, Northern England, breaking away from the rugby union institution, so known as the RFU or the Rugby Football Union, breaking away, and it was all about money, right? So rugby union, in essence, always wanted to remain amateur rugby. So what happened was with these clubs, because they were all working class players, they ended up not getting compensated for the time they're missing at work. And that became a problem, and they were fighting for that right. And that's where they decided to form their own, let's call it sport on its own, called rugby league. And that was actually where the players were compensated even back in 1895, which was quite interesting. So variations are slightly different. So in general, it looks like the same sport, slightly smaller pants. I'm just joking. It's like this. But in essence, the same type of format, but they did make it a little bit more quicker. So for example, each team gets 6 opportunities to get tackled. So if I get tackled, like in rugby union, there's a bit of a contest for the ball, there's a bit of a ruck or a maul, it takes time. In this case, as soon as you get tackled, you need to leave the tackled player, and the game proceeds. For 6 tackles, if they don't score by that time, you lose possession, you hand over. That's just to make it a bit more of a spectacle, because obviously they need to fund this new model and obviously get a lot of spectators in the stadium to do so. So, and mostly around the world, it didn't really pick up as much. But if you go to Australia now, you will actually find that rugby league is actually more popular than union. Probably the only big rugby playing country which is the case. So mainly you see that being played in Australia, New Zealand, and still very big in England as well.
Interesting.
So that's just to give the difference between the two. Just to make a comparison, so I've mentioned professionalism. So rugby union at the end did become professional, but it's exactly 100 years later, in 1995. After the Rugby from 95 World Cup, SANZA, which is a combination between South Africa, New Zealand and Australia, formed their own organization, and they put pressure on World Rugby to say, listen, we're going to go professional. And that's the origins of your Super Rugby at the time, where you have your franchises playing between the 3 countries, as well as the Tri-Nations.
Skalk, I have an interesting question that I'd like to throw your way. All rugby related, of course. With regard to the World Cup, often us newbies, all we hear, the countries that we hear that are mentioned, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, the UK often. Are there any countries within the BRICS Plus side of things that are on the rise?
Yeah. So there's quite a few different competitions also playing, Zizi. So you have for example, the African Cup, right? So there's some African countries competing, which will include some of those BRICS nations you just mentioned. Brazil is probably the most up-and-coming country. They feature quite nicely in the sevens format of the game, not really in the 15-man game, but they compete in the America's Cup, which includes your South American and North American teams. So that's coming up. And then the Asian Cup, you have your Chinese players dominating there.
Oh, wow.
Still not on that, what we refer to as tier 1 level, but definitely up and coming. And I think with a bit of resources, who knows, we might see some more BRICS representation coming into the World Cup as such. I think only other team that I can think of is Russia, obviously. They actually did qualify, not for the previous World Cup, but the 2019 World Cup, they actually did manage to qualify for that World Cup. So there is some opportunities for them to get through, yes.
Oh, interesting. That is very interesting. With regard to all these cups, I know about the 6 Nations.
Yes.
I am saying it correctly, right?
You are saying it correctly.
Thank goodness. What else is there, and what is the 6 Nations about?
Right, Zizi. So the 6 Nations is your top-tier European competition, which includes all your big rugby-playing nations. That's your England, your Wales, Scotland, Ireland, France, and Italy, right? So to appreciate this competition, you need to dial back 100 years or so to the year 1871. This is where England and Scotland actually played for the first international game. A few years later, it became an annual competition, which we'll refer to as the Kolkata Cup. And that was from 1879.
Wow.
So by 1883, they did include the rest of the home nations. Now, when we say home nations, for those who don't know, that includes all your UK countries, so England, Wales, Scotland, as well as Ireland. And they were competing as the initial, it's called home nations competition. By 1901, France also included, and that's actually the origins of the Five Nations. And this was competed thereafter every year up to the year 2000, when Italy also joined in to now, as we know it, the Six Nations. So quite an interesting history. It's also quite a competitive competition. So if we only look at the Six Nations that's been played since 2000, you had England winning this cup 7 times. You had Wales and France each winning 6. You had Scotland winning 5, and then unfortunately Italy still needs to get on the board. So it's not like we've seen with competitions like the World Cup, where you have certain teams just really dominating. And you also see the team going through seasons. Currently, you see Ireland being very competitive. They're also the current title holders, and they will defend this when they start in January next year. So we go through seasons, but very, very competitive, and always makes very good viewing as well.
I need to ask you something, because as you're explaining to me, I hear you mentioning tiers. How many tiers are there, and why? What does this mean? What is the significance?
Okay, so significance is because rugby's got, let's call them more professional teams, lesser professional teams, teams that perform much better, to ensure that you have strength-to-strength competitions and matchups. Most of these teams are kind of placed in tiers. So your tier 1 would be basically everybody that qualified for the Rugby World Cup, for example. They will be top of their game and more or less at the same level. Then you have tier 2, which will bring in up-and-coming teams that in most cases a bit more amateur still. Teams like Namibia, our neighbours up the road here, very strong, and they always qualify for World Cup, never perform, but unfortunately they're just an amateur status. But they do play in the African Cup, where now it's more strength to strength. So them playing against Kenya and the likes, they're all on the same footing, which makes it much more competitive for them, but also for themselves to grow into and climbing up the ranks. Unfortunately, funding is sometimes an issue, but with these competitions, they do attract a lot of viewership. So that brings them sponsorships, and ultimately for World Rugby to kind of grow the game all over as well. Quite interesting, just in the women's side, we're going to get to the competition now, but we actually see 3 tiers, and that's really just to promote, because of the difference is so much in the women's game, that they really want to have strength by strength and have the teams coming up. South Africa, as we know, they dominate the men's side of things. We're actually not in the ladies' side. So now you see a team that's up and coming, but it's better for them to now currently still play in tier 2, strength to strength, build confidence, and really just getting to that level and get infrastructure in place to reach that tier 1 spot.
Oh, wow. So we've spoken about the Rugby World Cup, we've spoken about the Six Nations, and if my memory serves me correctly in my education about rugby, the last one is what's happening at this present moment, which is the championship.
So the championship, quite rightly so. So that's now similar to...
Formerly the Tri-Nations, correct?
Formerly Tri-Nations. So
see, I'm learning.
You remember from the previous episode. So in the Rugby Championship, basically that brings back your strongest Southern Hemisphere teams kind of competing it out. So let's quickly look at the history first. So you're quite right. Tri-Nations, and we spoke about rugby becoming professional with Sanza coming into play. 1996 was the very first Tri-Nations. That ran through up to 2012. So it was a long competition before Argentina joined in, and now the championship as we know it. Fortunately, well, not unfortunately, but different from your Six Nations is that here we do see one team dominating this competition, and that's the All Blacks. So if you take both competitions together, they already managed to secure 20 titles. So it's 10 Tri-Nations and 10 championship titles, way ahead of South Africa, only on 7 combined. Australia sitting on 6, and unfortunately Argentina still needs to get on that scoreboard. So New Zealand definitely dominating, and I think it just definitely suits their type of style. But we've seen in the last one, times are changing, it seems. So
times are changing, and guys, listen, I'm a newbie and I'm learning fast. So just stick with the Scrumdown, and you guys at home will learn as well.
I think just before we kind of wrap things up, I think it's also noteworthy. Let's talk quickly about women rugby, because it's not as broadly doesn't get as much exposure as the men's version, but you see things are changing quite nicely internationally.
Yes, I think I just recently read that there is a tournament about to start. Or it may have already started.
Yeah. So historically, we saw a women's rugby World Cup since 1991. So it's always been there. But the problem was always you had your dominant players really taking charge in your dominant countries. We will be seeing the start of the WXV competition, which makes it different from the Rugby World Cup, is that it already placed the teams into those 3 tiers we mentioned
That's
before.
the women's 15.
Quite nicely picked up there. I think they're all trying to make it quite flashy, but that's exactly that.
I'm winning.
which makes it quite nice, is that you now see the women's rugby playing strength by strength, and technically it's 3 competitions in one. And really, this is going to give them international viewership. It's going to give them opportunity just to showcase themselves on a much bigger platform, and hopefully this is going to kickstart women's rugby, and we desperately want this. We've seen in South Africa a much stronger domestic league, but still the ladies Springboks are still not there where they should be, and hopefully other countries can also learn from this to start investing in. So
I'm excited, can't wait to see.
Fantastic. So Cici, I think that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you so much for the chat. It's always nice to share some knowledge with some newbies.
Thank you so much. I feel like I'm learning so much, and I'm super excited to see what happens on our next episode.
Fantastic. Looking forward to that.
Me too.
And we're going to delve much more deeper into this, but also talking about what's happening currently in rugby, and hopefully we can get some fans out there, new fans. So what do you think?
Love it. Looking forward.
Thanks, Cici. It was fantastic having a chat with you.
Thank you, Skull.
Cool.